Yeah. Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Hey, everybody. Scott Mann. I spent most of my adult life as a U.S. Army Special Forces officer, also known as Green Berets. And I found myself working in trust depleted, undergoverned, high risk areas around the world, mostly Afghanistan post 9/11. And the other thing I would probably throw out is the charter of what I did for a living and what Green Berets do is very different than what you see in the movies and what you see Navy SEALs and others do who specialize in kind of surgical strike stuff. We're elite forces, but our specialty is actually to work by, with, and through indigenous communities and to help them stand up on their own. So everything that we do is from the inside out, community based, local, and mostly based on interpersonal skills.
I've followed you for years now. You've being on our stage, and you had your play last out here in Santa Barbara.
Sure did.
And so I've gotten to hear you many times talk about, and it amazes me every time that you guys would go in and again, you make that distinction between other special force, special ops, and what you do. You go in and you have to find ways to build community, build relationship in, I think you told me once, 45 seconds. You, you've got to,
Yeah.
you're reading your nonverbal communications with people and you have your translators, but that just sounds so hard, but that's critical to what you do.
It's strategic. And when you think about how international terrorists and other bad actors operate, they go into these undergoverned at-risk areas that are depleted as informal civil societies, and they set up shop. And so if you're going to create an antibody to international terrorism and these bad actors, then the best way to do that is a resilient community that can stand up on its own against that kind of influence. And to do that, you have to have social capital. You can't go in guns
Mm.
blazing, elbowing your way into the room or shooting your way into the room. And by the way, we learned those lessons the hard way after 9/11. Even as a special forces community, we were so angry after the way the 9/11 happened that we went in mostly focused on retribution, and it failed miserably. And so it was only in getting back to our roots, Mark, that we figured out, like, if you're going to help communities be an antibody to bad actors, the only way is to build rapport with that person across from you who's tickling the trigger of their AK-47 in 5 minutes or less, or you're dead.
I really love the visualization of antibodies because I think we've all, coming out of COVID, saw lots of videos of molecules and germs and bugs and viruses and things like that.
Yeah.
And you talk about terrorism, foreign terrorism, but we have this terrorism here now in the United States. And
Mm.
everything you were just saying just made me think of that. Is it the same or is it different?
Well, I refer to it as the churn, the unique set of social conditions that exist in our civil society today. I think are unprecedented and novel. They've certainly evolved in a way in the last 5 years, unlike anything that we've ever seen. And when I came home from the military just a few years ago in retirement, and I came home to a country, honestly, I didn't recognize anymore.
Mm.
Much of what I'd seen in these low trust, high risk areas around the world had permeated our civil society now. And as Sebastian Younger says in his book Tribe, most combat veterans are more than willing to die for their country. They just don't know how to live for it. And it's hard to know how to live for a country that's
Mm.
tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from religion to race to politics, as we're seeing now in the election. And so this churn, this shadow primalism, where we form factions rather than a civil society that bridges across those in and out groups, is probably the greatest threat that we face today, more so than any other threat externally. It is the division within our own society.
Talk about shadow primalism.
Right. So the way I try to explain it to folks is we are very primal creatures. We really haven't changed a lot in several 100,000 years. We still navigate the world very similar. Adam Ghazali, in his book, The Distracted Mind, he talks about how we are ancient brains just trying to make
Mm.
sense of a high tech world. And we're not doing a great job of it because we are primal creatures. And most of what motivates us and takes us through the world is below the waterline of our existence, of our nature. So if human nature was an iceberg and the modern world's the tip of the iceberg, that's only 20% of who we are, although it seems all encompassing. What's below the waterline is 80% of our nature. And it's a meaning seeking, emotional, social storyteller who struggles. It's a very primal creature. And we've lost connection with that, Mark. So, what does that mean? What happens is when we lose touch with our nature, for example, when we ignore the fact that we tend to go to in group, out group behavior when we're angry, when we're afraid, then if we don't know that about ourselves when we are angry and afraid, like we are today with social media and the election cycle and 24/7 news, we revert to that primal behavior. The only difference is it's a shadow version because we don't even recognize that we're doing it. We're doing it. We're in a trance-like state while we're doing it. So we're demonstrating this primal behavior without even being conscious of it as we do it.
So when you do the 80/20, it makes me think of that, to your point, conscious is 20%. That's our, our conscious
Right.
competence, so to speak. And then the unconscious is the other 80%, our unconscious competence. And you're suggesting that fear gets triggered. That's 80%. That's like 4 times more than our conscious being. So that's a very strong behavior.
And I think that's a great way of putting it. And I believe that because the brain is a metaphorical pattern matching organ, you can map
Right,
so much onto that
right.
iceberg. That's why the iceberg is so commonly used for things like this. But I do think in our exuberance to be modern, in our excitement to show how sophisticated we are and how we navigate the world, we've excluded the realities of our primal selves, that what I call the human operating system is still very, very much what it was 200,000 years ago. It's just now that we believe we're beyond that. We're not capable of feud or resentment or reciprocity or even the trance-like state that comes from storytelling. We've just pushed all of that down to the point that now we're so we've got our heads in these dopamine dispensers to a point that we're not connected to the natural world anymore. And I think that's where a lot of this fear-based and anger-based behavior is taking us into a form of primal factioning that is very dangerous, and it doesn't end well.
Primal factioning. Tell me more about that.
In groups and out groups, right? Whenever, all mammals form groups to survive, humans are no different. We've been doing it for tens of thousands of years. We form in groups to acquire resources, to protect resources. Some of them are called tribes, clans, qualms, depending on where you are in the world. But as a Green Beret, I spent most of my time working in these informal civil societies where in and out group behavior was a part of daily life. But what you also see is what Robert Putnam talks about in his book, Bowling Alone, is these different in groups and out groups. That's a kind of trust known as bonding trust. You only trust the people in your circle. You only trust the people who look like you, believe like you. But there's another form of trust and social capital that the United States and other liberal democracies formed recently called bridging trust, where you can actually bridge beyond your in group and your out group, right? You can actually bridge beyond that and form networks and elements of civil society that go beyond your clan or your tribe or your group. And I think that's really what's made our country as effective as what it is in this social experiment we call democracy. But because now we're operating in so much fear and so much anger, when that happens, that bridging trust of going beyond in groups is not a natural thing in the world. It requires leadership and stewardship and rule of law. And when we become afraid, what happens is we don't lose trust. We go back to the trust we know at a primal level, and we go back to our factions. We go back to the people and the groups we feel the safest with. And if you look around the country, you see that today. People are withdrawing.
Everywhere.
They're
Yeah.
withdrawing into their factions and their groups because they're afraid. And this is what we do. But the problem is we're doing it in a trance state, and we're not even
Mm.
conscious of it as we do it. We're doing it almost in a trance state. And unfortunately, many of our leaders are practicing what I call divisionism. They're actually fomenting that factioning in order to advance a narrow agenda instead of being stewards for that bridging trust that we need. So leaders are, I think, that's the problem is nobody's coming. The leaders are stepping back from their stewardship roles, and that fear-based behavior is pulling us into in groups and out groups.
Well, I'm hoping that people will listen to this and take heart. When you were talking about bridging trust in my world, it's called network weaving.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a whole idea. But I'm guessing what you're saying is, to use a shields up metaphor, is like our shields are up and then we'll let them down and look over, or we'll let them all the way down with our trust. and what you're suggesting is they're up and locked right
They
now.
are, and it's a primal response, that Dr. Ivan Tyrrell talks about in the Human Givens. He says, that when we are afraid or angry or in a highly aroused emotional state, our sympathetic nervous system takes over, and we go into fight,
Right.
flight, or freeze. And when that we go into a trance state, and the higher functions of our cortex drop. He says we even appear stupid when we surrender to
Huh.
anger. We lose our agency. And we lose our ability for shared perspective. And I've seen this as a Green Beret. I've seen this in these low trust areas that we get dropped into by definition. That's why you're there, is to try to restore some level of social capital. So for me, this isn't theory. I've seen it over and over again at the
Right.
most extreme case. But here's the cool thing about it, and why I think this is important for folks watching or listening, is that I've also seen entire communities that didn't trust each other, didn't trust us, within a very short period of time, overcome that churn. And all of a sudden, they're up on the rooftops standing alongside each other, like I talked about in my first TEDx with you all at Santa Barbara. And I've started to call that rooftop leadership, where you bridge beyond the fear, the anger, the in groups, the out groups, and you build a level of social capital that is so strong that people are willing to go up on their proverbial rooftops and take a stand together. You see it during hurricanes, you see it during times of crisis, but I've actually seen it manifest just through old school interpersonal skills that leaders demonstrate. And I think that's what we need today more than ever.
I'm gonna guess, because the things that I've learned from you and the things that you teach are able to be put into like 3, 4, or 5 things you can remember. Because my reptilian brain loves a quick little recipe. And what the people who are listening, what could they do?
Well, I think the first thing is to put your own oxygen mask on first. When you're going
Okay.
through the election, when you're going through these times and you get spun up, or you notice that your emotional temperature is clicking up into the red, right? And when that happens, one of the first things that we have to do is we have to manage our own emotional temperature. We have to put our own oxygen mask on first and not allow ourselves to go into that sympathetic state or fight, flight, or freeze. That's an appropriate response if you've got to pull your kids out of a burning building. It's not an appropriate response if someone across from you disagrees with the candidate that you like. That's not an appropriate first world response. A sympathetic state response, you can still talk issues, you can still have civil discourse and disagree. So we've got to bring our emotional temperature down where we're ready to listen to what the other party has to say. And most of that's diaphragmatic breathing, a good belly breath, 3 to 5 belly breaths. And then force yourself to ask a thoughtful, open-ended question to the other party that helps you see the pictures in their head. So now I want to shift it
Mm,
from putting my own oxygen mask on to I just want to see the pictures in the head of the other party. Right.
mhm,
It's just pure
mhm,
discovery. And those
mhm,
questions probably would start with what or how, not
mhm,
why, not why in an election year. What
mhm,
or how? What led you to that conclusion? How do you think
mhm.
that would show up in our society today? I mean, and then listen with pure discovery. And what'll start to happen is their emotional temperature will start to come down. It'll start high, and then all of a sudden you start to see the pictures in their heads, their pain and their goals. And then at some point, it could be, would it be okay if I shared something with you? And then you share your narrative, your perspective.
I
And I
love
think
that. I love the question to get permission.
it's the point of entry for any high stakes engagement is questionology. 2/3 of every engagement I learned as a Green Beret was questionology, what Chris Voss calls
Sure.
tactical
Yeah.
empathy or calibrated questions. But he and
Yeah.
I both arrived at that in two very different fields,
Uh,
but two very very high stakes fields. And I can tell you, he's spot on. I
yeah.
think that's a questionology. 2/3 of the engagement to get the pictures in the head after you've managed your own emotional temperature, and the ROI on that is shared perspective.
Mm,
Not a bad thing to have these days.
mm. Well, that's the bridge. The bridge is built one, I mean, whatever metaphor we're going to use, it's just one little conversation at a time, one question, one interaction at a time. And that back and forth, we know that we build trust that way, and we have trust with that other person. And I love the distinction, what and how, not why.
Yeah.
That's really important. How do you sustain that? or how do we sustain that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, first of all, this is why I differentiated. I think we need a new grammar, a new language for some of the
Mm,
things we talk about. And bridging trust and bonding trust, I think, are so important. It's to think of that iceberg and to recognize that that primal factioning is a very real thing. It's natural. We're going to do it when we're afraid or we're angry, but it's not a good place to be in a civil society that is a liberal democracy, right? It's okay to have your in groups and your out groups to an extent, but when they start to eclipse the narratives that we tell ourselves as a nation, when they start to eclipse the things like out of many come one, the principles that we aspire to be in our Constitution and just our higher selves, that's when it becomes a problem. And left to its devices, in groups and out groups will eclipse this bridging mentality. And so, as leaders, family leaders, parents, coaches, I think it's imperative that we understand the difference between bridging trust and bonding trust. Bonding trust is what happens naturally when we're afraid and we form groups. Bridging trust is a form of social capital that's possible if we get out of our comfort zone, see the pictures in the head of the other party, and bridge beyond our in group. And that's what we should aspire to as an end game. That's where the sustainment comes in, because the return on investment is a civil society that can actually get big stuff done even when we're in different in and out groups, if bridging trust underpins everything. But that requires a special kind of leadership.
Scott, this is, I mean, we could talk for hours. If what could we leave our audience with a simple thought of something they could do today?
Make a human connection first. Like, there's anything that I learned in almost 2 decades as a Green Beret, working with people that were radically different than me in very dangerous, low trust situations, that I think is relevant today, is no matter what your agenda is, no matter how soon you need to get to your slides or your pitch or your offer, or how much you want to just get your teenager out of the way so that you can get back to your phone, make a human connection first. And then once that's done, that palpable human connection, then get to the agenda.
Scott, thanks for coming back to the TEDx Santa Barbara Salon. We deeply appreciate your service, first off, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.